So I'm gonna go out on a limb here. I genuinely don't think that A Shed for Edward is as bad as people make it out to be. I would even go as far as to say that it's one of the CGI series' best episodes. Before I start this video, I want to say that this will all just be my opinion. I'm not trying to change anyone else's mind, rather just give my own input. Now, with that said, if it wasn't obvious, most fans outright despise this episode, which I more than understand why they do. For those who don't know, Season 21 came out with a lot of controversies. A few things that were announced before this season was going to air was the announcement of Thomas, quote-unquote, going around the world. As a result, quite a few changes to the show would be made, one of which being Thomas would be replacing the narrator, meaning Thomas would be both the narrator and a character? Which still doesn't completely sit right with me.
And that's when Duck had an idea. Did you find yourself a coach to pick up the children, Duck? Haha!
Season 21 would also be affected by this new Around the World update, in two major ways to be exact. The first one would be an extreme cut of episodes, in this season specifically. On average, the show would have about 26 episodes per season. This season originally was meant to be no different. However, due to the Big World Big Adventure changes, 8 episodes were scrapped. This would evidently make Season 21 the shortest season ever, even including the new All Engines Go update. The other big change, which is in strong correlation to the topic of this video, was that 2 characters of the main cast, otherwise known as the Steam Team, would be made into background characters in place of 2 female characters. Right away, Thomas fans immediately started theorizing. Thomas, James, and Percy were immediately off the table because at the time they were the series' poster boys. Gordon most likely wouldn't get the boot because of his standing with the audience, not just with the adult fans, but with the kids. Emily did have a chance of getting booted, but since she was a girl, it would defeat the purpose of the whole gender diversity thing that they were going for, which left Edward and Henry in the spotlight. And sure enough, in late 2017, A Shed for Edward was released on TV. And it's safe to say that nobody was happy. Now, I think this episode is rated unfairly by the fandom, and that it deserves a lot more credit than it's given. For a long while, I thought this episode was pretty bad too for what it did, but upon a few rewatches, I genuinely love how it does it. In fact, I would even go as far as to say it's one of the... Oh shit, I already put that in the script, never mind. For a quick summary, in a previous episode titled The Fastest Red Engine on Sodor, Sodor's number 5, James, was showing off, always screeching his brakes at stations to stop. One day, he decided to have a race with Rosie to determine who was the faster red engine, only to slam on his brakes, with Rosie noticing how loudly they screeched, and how long it took him to stop.
I don't think you should be racing.
She recommended he go to the Steamworks to get his brakes checked, so he went. But once he arrived, he thought the issue wasn't there anymore. He left and continued to go fast again. He raced across Sodor and crashed into Tidmouth Sheds.
Oh no!
He was taught to take care of small issues before they become bigger ones. And more importantly, he was the fastest red engine on Sodor for quite a little bit. Now, why is this important, you may ask? This episode started a trilogy arc, and A Shed for Edward is the second episode in this story. The episode starts in the middle of the fastest red engine on Sodor. Edward and Philip, the diesel boxcar, are casually puffing along the line, heading to a station. When James comes flying by, he loses control, and he crashes into Tidmouth Sheds. Something I love is that rather than making up a new reason for the Tidmouth Sheds being broken, they used the events of a previous episode for continuity. It really feels classic series to me. It makes the season feel less episodic and more plot-driven, which is something that Thomas has always been good at. Later that night, Edward and Thomas had to find a new place to stay so that the sheds could be repaired. While the Fat Controller was thinking of a place for Edward, Philip offered to let Edward sleep in the Wellsworth sheds with him, which he agreed to. Once they got there, Philip stayed up all night talking, which kept Edward up. The next morning, he's exhausted, and then he went to go check out the sheds. Topham says it'll be a week, and I just want to point out the time frame here. A week with that massive of a hole is pretty good. That wall could easily have taken multiple weeks. Impressive building time frame. God, I'm such a nerd. Edward spends the next few nights looking for places to sleep. But considering all the places that he chooses are actually pretty stupid, he never really falls asleep, leaving him sleep deprived. He falls asleep in the middle of his run and nearly crashes into Percy, but Philip managed to wake my boy up. Philip is thanked, and he tells Edward how much he misses him. Edward comes clean, telling Philip that he needs his sleep and he can't stay up all night talking. And finally, later that night, Edward gets some sleep, returning to the sheds the next morning, fully recharged, and the sheds are fully repaired. And finally, after the shit week he's had, Edward is given the opportunity to come home, only to stay with Philip. This is where the fandom hates the episode. Like I said earlier, I fully understand why people hate this episode. Nobody wanted to see Edward leave. Absolutely no one. So of course the episode where Edward took his leave would rub fans the wrong way. However, I don't think this is really fair. It's not the episode's fault that Edward was written out of the STEAM team. Even less so for how the show handled him afterwards. But this is the episode that most fans gravitate to when they're looking for a scapegoat. Again, I can understand why people do, but I do feel like the fandom is thinking way too much about what was done rather than how it was handled. When you really think about it, Edward was going to be written out of the main cast either way, so this episode would have been hated regardless of what it was. Or at least, that's what I'm thinking anyways. I'm more than likely wrong, but I can't say for sure since, well, it never happened. So this episode, I feel stands out because of how Edward went out. Edward, in his truest form, is a mentor character who always gives good advice and is willing to lend a helping buffer to anyone, especially the little ones. But on his own, he never gives up. He always pushes himself to get work done. Whether it's pushing a train up a hill,
I can't do it. I can't do it. I can't do it. I will do it. I will do it.
or something extremely severe, like getting a fully loaded passenger train home uphill in stormy weather with a broken crank pin. I still don't understand how Edward did that, but he did, so he's the GOAT. Edward is always thinking about the well-being of others before himself, but not in a way that's actively damaging him mentally. He's a father figure through and through to the younger engines, and at his absolute worst, is willing to put other people in the corner to teach them a lesson. He does what he can to help, and most importantly wants others to grow. We see this in multiple instances. One of the smaller examples is this interaction from the Diseasel.
Bill and Ben, why are you playing here? We're not playing, protested Bill. We're rescuing trucks, squeaked Ben. What do you mean? Even you don't come in our yard without asking, and you only take the trucks we give you. But, they both squeaked indignantly, this Diseasel didn't even ask. He just took the lot. There is no cause to be rude, said Edward severely.
He immediately scolds Bill and Ben after them being douchey, the same way a father would a child if he's being mean to another kid. Or in Thomas and the Trucks. In all three interpretations of this story, Edward lets Thomas take his train, giving him a chance to pull a train and see the world outside of the yard. The same way a father would let his son or daughter practice helping others, or doing work. A chance to give the child something new to do and teach them the values of working. In The Adventure Begins specifically, after Thomas messes up, Edward immediately offers comfort and support.
I'm sorry, Edward. This is all my fault.
Never mind, Thomas. At least we're working together again.
My favorite example, though, is Old Reliable Edward, where Thomas and Edward pay out Gordon for his bullshit. Edward helps Gordon up a hill, only for Gordon to put him down, calling him old and unreliable. Edward complains to Thomas about his struggles, and Thomas immediately wants to pay Gordon out, which he does the next day, and when Edward conveniently shows up, he uses Gordon's words against him, forcing him into an apology and making him realize Edward really isn't as useless as he claims.
Oh, but I didn't think you needed any help from me. After all, I'm so old and unreliable.
Now, most of the fans could be asking this question. Wouldn't it have been better if Edward showed his willingness to never give up? Like something along the lines of Edward's exploit? Well, in my personal opinion, no. No, it wouldn't. While yes, an episode like this would no doubt be badass to see Edward pulling through one last time to prove all the haters wrong, this has already been done before, and in my opinion, would be a lot worse than what we've got. We've seen this trope dozens of times before. You know what? Here are all the ones that I could think of immediately. That's not me saying that these episodes are bad. In fact, these are some of the greatest episodes in the series. Well, for the most part. But if they did do this trope again, not only would it not hit as hard as the others, but with how the CGI era is written, they'd most likely regress Gordon and James again, which wouldn't work. James has already been seen to be extremely trusting of Edward in a job that he wanted to do, which, given who James is, 9 times out of 10 would be something that he would never do for anyone else. And Gordon has already learned his lesson. Hell, even this era showed an episode where Gordon was being a dick, and he got his comeuppance only for Edward to save the day. Gordon knows that Edward is nowhere near as useless as he claimed. So if Edward were to have a final send-off episode, after years of constantly proving himself, and the STEAM team just thinks he's useless before the events of this episode, not only would all the characters regress again, but it would make the interactions that Gordon and James had with Edward feel extremely disingenuous. The other major part of Edward's character was his father figure, nature, thing. It's always been shown, but really hasn't been much of a focus as much as it is in this story. I can only name 2 solid times where Edward's father figure status was displayed in a story beyond a few lines of dialogue. One of these, fittingly enough, was the 2015 movie The Adventure Begins. In fact, that was Edward's whole storyline, him teaching Thomas the ways of the railway. A Shed for Edward is extremely similar in this case. While Edward never says anything wise in this episode, Philip is both stated and shown to really love Edward. He looks up to him, and at the end of the day, Edward leaves to do what he has been since day one: teach and comfort the little guy. In the beginning of the original book series, this character was Thomas. In the Deputation, it was Percy. In the later half of the books, this was Bill and Ben. In The Adventure Begins, this was Thomas. And now, it's Philip. A young diesel boxcar who hasn't an engine to stay with him, and he's still got a lot of growing up to do. Huh. Sounds like a little tank engine who wanted to see the world. Edward started the CGI series timeline as a mentor to a young, excitable engine. And he finished it by going off to do the exact same thing. Now, there are 2 more reasons that the fandom disliked this episode. That being, Edward barely does anything in the show after this, and that Philip and Edward never really interact again. First off, Edward and Philip. Yeah, I more than understand where people are coming from here. A Shed for Edward made everyone think that Edward and Philip would become a secondary duo, a mentor and a student, similar to how Thomas and Edward were at the beginning. Only to just not get that. I do understand why people hate the episode because of it. Hell, I felt a little weird too, knowing that these 2 only interacted never after this episode. But I don't think it's fair to judge the episode for the writing team's decision. That isn't the episode's fault. And honestly, if we were to go by that logic, why doesn't everyone dislike the TV show's adaptation of Edward's exploit? In both the original and the adaptation, Edward gained the respect of the rest of the engines who hadn't respected him originally. However, in the TV series, this expectation was eventually broken in Season 6's Edward the Really Useful Engine, where all the big engines started disrespecting Edward again. This became the status quo for years.
Edward is a useless old steam pot, Gordon sniffed. He should be retired.
Fancy sending a back engine to do an express engine's jobs. He'll lose the race and let the whole railway down.
You took your time, Edward. You're so old and slow, I'm surprised Sir Topham Hatt keeps you on.
Hell, even the previously mentioned old reliable Edward. Gordon still viewed Edward as a weak old engine, long after the events of Edward's exploit. Do we hate Edward's exploit, the episode, for this? No, because this isn't the episode's fault. It was just a decision that was made in the writing room later on. This is most likely the case with A Shed for Edward. It isn't the episode's fault that Edward and Philip never interacted again. This also applies to the Edward barely appears again argument, which I think is even less fair. Season 22, which is the season directly after the season where A Shed for Edward was from, Edward was very much still a common character to see. He was in School of Duck as a background character. He was in Forever and Ever and Rosie is Red. Forever and Ever specifically I thought was an amazing Edward appearance. And he even got a Spotlight episode, which is praised amongst the fan base. And I personally think it's pretty funny. Why do I bring these up? Well, in season 23, Edward didn't have a single line of dialogue. Even though this unfortunately was the case, this was a whole 2 years after Edward was written out of the STEAM team. I genuinely don't believe the writing team wanted to forget about Edward after this. It wasn't the writer's intent to forget about him, it just sort of happened. A story arc should be judged by its stories, yes, don't get me wrong, but you can't fault the story because a story arc that you wanted wasn't made. Again, it was the decision of the writing room that was made later on. It's not the episode's fault. Now, with all that said, do I think A Shed for Edward is the perfect send-off for Edward? Well, no. There could definitely be a few things the writers could have done better. As much as I praise the episode for how Edward left, it kind of feels weird a bit knowing that if James hadn't crashed into the sheds previously, Edward most likely wouldn't have left and stayed with Philip. But considering that Edward was given the opportunity to leave or stay, rather than being forced out for circumstances out of his control, I don't think it really matters that much to me. But other than that, I genuinely feel the writers did an extremely good job with this episode. Now, you've all seen the title. Why did I go with the phrase, "a treat spoiled by the sting"? Well, in my honest opinion, that's exactly what this episode is. It's a sweet, cozy Edward episode where Edward takes his leave to help a newer, way younger character. An episode that feels very Season 5-esque to me. However, it was soonly spoiled by the sting of Edward leaving the STEAM team. The general opinion of this episode was negatively affected as a whole in so many fans' eyes because of that. Do I blame them? No, not at all. People have different tastes. We all have different things we like and we don't like. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to how you feel. And I felt that I wanted to shed some light on a Thomas episode that I feel is extremely deprived of good words. If you like this episode because of me, that's great. But if you still dislike this episode for the reason that Edward was removed from the main cast, that's completely understandable. No matter how much people convince me, or try to, I still don't really care for most of the narrow gauge episodes. Apart from the Grandpa Duology, those are just peak, man, come on. So with that said, my name is Fluffy, and this has been A Shed for Edward. A treat spoiled by the sting.